This last talk is a rather hard act to follow. We have been under the spell of the University of California, but I'm going to try to break the spell. You may be happy or not to think that I'm not going to speak about the University of California, both because David Gardner gave you this comprehensive review of how it works, and then yesterday Sheldon Rothblatt gave an analytical perspective from a point of view that he suggests that I share, and in fact I do share. And he just said very much what I would have said, but probably better than I would have said it. So I do want to say one thing before I do leave the subject of the University of California, and that is that I had the pleasure to have served as the chair of the statewide academic senate for the last 2 years of David Gardner's presidency, and therefore sat with the regents. He made the point not on the regents. We were very careful never to become members of that Board of Regents because we had to represent the faculty, and if we had become members of the Board of Regents, we'd have taken a different kind of responsibility and we would have had an academic union, which we don't have. We are, in a kind of way, an academic union, although we're not elected in the same way, and there are certain advantages for there not being, very considerable advantages for our not having a union. But I want to say I sat, so to speak, at his feet, and for this time, not only watching him on the board, but also during other times when the chair of the Senate works with the president fairly closely. And you saw a very extraordinary person that continually astonished me, a combination of an incredible grasp of detail, at the same time a grasp of a breadth of patterns and knowledge and insight of an analytical kind. So that on the whole, he was the smartest man in any room that he was in. And that tended to be very impressive for everybody. He also had a lot of capacities to know a great deal of detail and fit it into a pattern that he wanted to. And he didn't like surprises, so ahead of these regents' meetings, he would make sure to have spoken to all the regents on any of the issues that he conceivably might be interested in. And he's very persuasive, and so he made these very powerful men, very rich and powerful heads of corporations and the like, sit up on little stools like lions and tigers in a circus. And he stood there with a small whip and made them jump through hoops. It was to see that is a quite, and the other thing is, at one time, he went away for a month, and someone else chaired that meeting, and the lions and tigers came down off their little stools and clawed one another. So you got a vivid sense of the extraordinary capacity of that man to know detail and to also be politically savvy in the law. It was quite an interesting experience. In any event, I want to, as I promised you, not talk about the University of California anymore, unless if you want to ask any questions, I could certainly try this. But I have actually set aside the paper that I brought with me to read here, and rather wrote some notes trying to respond to some of the issues that I've heard expressed here. So I think that these notes, you have to keep in mind that they're just now written in lieu of sleep, may be rather more disconnected than you might expect from a prepared paper. Anyway, we have, by general agreement, come here, Technion, for a very short conference on a very large subject. That is nothing less than how a national system of higher education in all its forms can be advised to make the transition from the system of elite research universities plus some other institutions of post-secondary education into a system of related, diverse institutions adapted to much larger numbers of students of diverse talents and purposes. In our shorthand, we call that the transition from elite to mass higher education. Now, in these few minutes, and I really do mean for them to be few minutes, we can each individually only address a fragment of that larger problem. So in my few minutes, I'd like to first, in very summary form, lay out what I see as a few necessary reforms or changes to allow an elite system to make this transition while both preserving the virtues of the elite universities while extending access to both old and new forms of higher education and to much larger numbers of students. But I might say at the outset that this task involves both the problems associated with the transition from elite to mass, with some suggestions of how given countries can meet those problems. In my experience, in having seen this transition take place or in the process of going on in different advanced societies, that on the whole, the problems associated with the transition are generic, but the solutions are unique, affected very much by the particular economic, political, social, and cultural conditions of a given society. So I will say with almost a formula now that you have to be wary about any suggestions and recommendations that you hear from abroad, although it doesn't stop students of comparative higher education from giving advice about how to solve the problems associated with this transition. But we know in our hearts that we speak with a good deal more confidence about the nature of the problems attendant on the transition than on how to solve them. Despite this, I think we can still at least find some patterns in the kinds of changes and reforms that need to be made for society to make this transition successfully. And by successful, I mean without great loss of the virtues of the elite forms and their extension in appropriate ways to more diverse institutions and much larger numbers of students. If you want an example of a relatively unsuccessful transition to mass higher education, you need look no further than the United Kingdom. It has made this transition by brute force. It would take me a long time to talk about it, although I mean to say a few more things. And besides, Leslie Wagner yesterday has given us some sense already of the way that process has developed in the UK. And I really, later on, toward the end of my remarks, want to say a little more about that. Anyway, right here, I only want to point to some very few structural or organizational changes. Some of these repeat things that other people said, but nonetheless, for my comprehensive review, I have to come back to them. These are changes within institutions and between the institutions and the state. These are changes that I believe necessary for successful transition. And at the very end of my remarks, I want to put on the table a matter that perhaps hasn't had sufficient attention from those of us who study comparative higher education. That is the twin issues of the culture of institutions of higher education and of the culture that governs the relationship of the system to government, two different kinds of cultures within which these changes occur. Now, I believe that among the structural changes, or call them reforms if you want, reform is a rather charged word in Sweden for many years. The word reform had a very positive charge to it. If it was a reform, then it was necessarily a good thing. I don't want to be quite so dogmatic here, but these are changes that can be seen in some places and not in others. One of them is the grant by governments of greater autonomy from governmental supervision to the institutions. Autonomy both over the raising of resources and the uses of those resources. This seems almost necessary to allow institutions to adapt themselves to the changing circumstances associated with growth and diversity. That doesn't mean that every society does that, but when it doesn't, I'm suggesting problems arise. Second, there is the strengthening of the role of the institutional president under whatever name he may have, he or she. Here, too, we can see the functional necessity of the reform. Under conditions of rapid and continuous change in the map of knowledge, in the size and cost of the institution, in its growing and changing student body, and its in a sensitive connection to its funding sources, someone must be able to speak for the institution as a whole. You just heard in the brilliant lecture before why it is that someone has to have that responsibility and authority, and how effectively it can be exercised if it's shared in a very careful way with others on a revocable basis. Anyway, someone must be able to speak for the institution as a whole and not just for one or more of its many interest groups. The weak presidency where it's found, elected for short terms with narrowly defined or limited authority, is a feature badly in need of reform and also a significant hindrance in achieving reform. Who else can or is motivated to initiate the other necessary changes within an institution, if not the one officer who has the whole interest of the institution in mind? We don't need more evidence of the difficulties arising out of the weak presidency. There are plenty of illustrations that I suspect will come to your mind. I mentioned here as elements helping the transition the issues of institutional autonomy and a strong presidency. The third element is a degree, I think, of formal diversification among the several segments of higher education, which differ in character, function, and cost. When a nation or society refuses to create or accept this, at least a measure of formal diversification, a series of unhappy consequences tend to follow. Some of them, many of them, unanticipated and unintended. And among those unhappy consequences are those for the colleges themselves. Those colleges devoted primarily to teaching. And the dream of becoming a research university, with the changes, I shouldn't call it dream, I should say hopes or aspirations, with the changes in status and funding that is supposed to follow, emerges as a serious distraction from the college's efforts to define its own distinctive character as an institution preparing for the first degree and offering a variety of professional master's degrees that require a good deal of specialized study in a whole range of new and semi-professions that characterize our service and technological society. The further and specialized study of engineering, education, varieties of management and administration, health-related services, and I could go on, are among those. These subjects have developed their own intellectual communities, their literatures, associations, credentials. They are central to the operation of modern societies. But they do not require study to the doctorate for the people who practice them, or the huge and expensive libraries and laboratories that are found in research universities. The temptation to subordinate this work to hopes for promotion, in quote, inverted commas, that temptation is extremely strong. It leads to pressures on people who are not, by temperament or training, researchers to do something that will result in publication. The result, terribly often, is an anxious and unhappy teachers and professionals and a body of published research that is not of high quality. Again, we have the sad example of the UK before us. The college yearning to become a research university also discovers that if it's successful, the new title will come with greater governmental regulation. The old universities are protected to some degree by traditions of academic freedom and autonomy. New ones are not. And they discover they have less freedom after designation as research universities than they did before. The unhappy consequences for the existing research universities are fairly clear, obvious. There is the dilution of research support available to each of the existing universities. There is difficulty in maintaining their scholarly and scientific standing in the world. There often is a distinct decline in the per capita support for students in teaching as the cost of colleges rise, and they're having to share a fairly fixed pot. And usually, and unexpectedly for them, they discover the extension to the old universities of the growth of governmental regulation that follows from the expansion of the title of research universities to institutions whom government sees as needing a lot of guidance in making the transition to the status of research university. Regulations designed originally for the new universities are applied to the old ones on the bureaucratic principle of equal treatment to all institutions. So in many ways, the remark in the UK was that the polytechnics were not transformed so much into universities, the universities were transformed into polytechnics. The consequences for the larger society encompass all of those difficulties, but also additional demands for more support for higher education, especially to fulfill the promises that were made to the new universities implicit in their promotion. But as was clear 3 or 4 decades ago, no society in the world, including the United States, is rich enough to support a system of mass higher education at the per capita cost of research universities. Well, I've mentioned as helpful to the transition that we're discussing here more autonomy for the institutions, a strong president, a broadly accepted binary system, or at least some ways of preserving segments of institutions different in character, function, and accessibility. Beyond this, the move toward mass higher education calls for the creation of strong and recurrent procedures for the assessment and maintenance of quality of teaching and research where the research is done, procedures in place within the institution rather than imposed on it from outside. The difference between internal and external procedures for quality control is enormous. I've been particularly interested in this matter over the years, and I've written on that issue at length elsewhere. But right now I can only add that successful quality maintenance by an institution over its own operations points to a certain kind of institutional culture, one marked by a spirit of self-criticism and a jealous regard for its own standing and reputation, whatever kind of institution it is, and in whatever segment of higher education it exists. Wherever it looks for that reputation, that culture is focused around the maintenance of its own reputation. And the culture of self-criticism and a lively spirit aimed at self-improvement arises most often under conditions of institutional competition. It is this spirit of competitive excellence. The emergence of this institutional culture is a very great achievement where it is achieved. It's hard to create, but it's a good deal easier to destroy. Indeed, one way to destroy it effectively is to replace it with an external system of assessment linked to funding. That crowds out and undermines the procedures in place that are based, if I may put it this way, on truth-telling and self-examination by colleagues talking to one another and reporting on what they're doing and how they're doing it. Examinations from outside by other bodies linked to funding are, I may put it delicately, not necessarily based on truth-telling. And that changes the whole character of that relationship. I wasn't prompted to say these things, I can only tell you. I'm not here to lobby for any position. Anyway, I've been describing a certain kind of institutional culture marked by clusters of attitudes, values, assumptions, many of them unspoken, which underlie the procedures through which the institution inspects itself and improves itself. But having put the concept of culture of institutions on the table, that's all I've done because it's a large subject, I'd like to do the same for the culture that governs the relation of the institutions and government. And again, we're talking about sets of assumptions, values, attitudes, rituals, and agreements, often tacit, that constitute the culture governing the relationship of higher education with government. I might say that one could do a kind of gloss on the lecture that we heard earlier this morning and unpack it, as the modern critics say, and talk about the variety of unspoken understandings and agreements that make that university work, but equally important, the kind of treaties, I call them, unspoken, tacit understandings between the university and the state bureaucracy. That is a set of independent understandings and agreements, formulas, that to a high degree are independent of the political pressures. They go on, one governor after another, to a high degree continually recognized and honored by the civil servants, I almost said bureaucrats, the civil servants in the state legislature and their counterparts in the university civil service. I might say there are about 1,000 of them in the president's office, because we have essentially the Ministry of Education or higher education inside the university and half the Department or Ministry of Finance inside the university. So there's a big bureaucracy there, and there is, I may say, certain degree of movement between these. So they get to talk to one another in the same language. Anyway, having put this concept of culture of the relationship between state and higher education on the table, here I want to make the contrast between a relationship based to a high degree on trust between partners in the service of the larger society, and one in which trust has been substantially withdrawn by government, and the relationship has come more to be seen as a contractual one between a government which buys educational goods and services of specified amounts and quality from institutions which provide them for fixed terms, renewable on different terms periodically at the discretion of the purchasing agent. For research universities, the goods are commonly defined as publications resulting from research. The services can be measured by input, as so many hours of instruction, or by output, as so many credit hours completed, or as so many degrees earned. This puts matters in a rather stark form, but the relationship of government and the universities in the UK has in recent years come to approximate this, at least in the intention of the government agencies purchasing the goods and services produced by the universities. And Leslie Wagner yesterday described some of those contractual relationships, and I was reminded again of them, having once studied the nature of those arrangements as they were invented in the ministry. Of course, matters are not so simple as I sketch them here, and the simplicity and clarity of the contractual relationship was blurred and complicated even in the UK by a long history marked by quite different attitudes and assumptions held by actors on both sides. Essentially, the problem for the Thatcher government was one of radically modifying long-standing traditional cultures of the relationship. But there was, for them, another and related set of problems associated with what is, I think we can call the commodification of higher education. There was both conceptual and practical problems facing government in its attempts to enforce what it had come to view as a set of contracts. And that involves counting both of the products of research and the inputs or outputs of teaching. But all of us know how difficult it is to quantify those activities in their full variety of both kinds and both of kind and of quality in academic life. It becomes finally extremely unpleasant to do that work and tempting to academics to manipulate the numerics. So far from being an effective means of quality control, the procedures became the arenas and instruments of manipulation and false reporting. So the fundamental business was trying to get inside this extremely arcane world, fundamentally in Burton Clark's term bottom-heavy, owned by the people who do it, trying to get them to provide reports which they don't like to quantify, don't think of in quantifiable terms, and when they're forced to do it and fill endless forms, they fill them in ways that bear some relationship to whatever the facts may be, but sometimes hard to see. I have on my book shelves at home a book entitled Great Engineering Disasters. A very interesting, useful book which discusses and analyzes a series of crises, why this bridge fell down, why this train derailed, why that dam broke. Engineers study and learn from their failures. Students and leaders of higher education should do likewise. And here we have the enormous advantage of having before us, in the experience of British higher education, in my view, a valuable textbook of policy mistakes. We find in the pages of that book, of that text, detailed history of policy mistakes and how, in a dynamic way, those errors led to clumsy and ill-advised efforts to correct them, only often to make their effects more grievous. It is an excellent first principle of decision-making as Israel continues in the transition toward mass higher education or beyond it. That principle might be, don't do what Britain has done. The British experience has the further advantage for us in that many of its decisions were made long enough ago so that we can now actually see their consequences and not merely speculate on what they may be. So study what they have done. And there are, I may say, some excellent critical and analytical histories of these past 3 or 4 decades in British higher education. They're a pleasure to read in a kind of ironic way, a pleasure to read, but also highly instructive. I think the gravest mistake in the UK, perhaps underlying all the others, was a fundamental change in the culture of the relationship between government and the worlds of higher education under the Thatcher government, and one that has not been repaired under Labour. Finally, I want to come back to the nature of relationships, in this case now not of departments or faculties or colleges or universities or governments, but of people. Grant Harman yesterday pointed to a variety of forms of binary systems around the world, some strictly enforced, others with permeable boundaries, others in which differentiation survives the apparent abolition of formal institutional distinctions. And his story shows that similar structural changes have different consequences depending on a lot of factors, not least the issue of the nature of the culture governing the relation of government to higher education in a given society. Among other things, that culture shapes, in fact, it's almost defined by the kinds of discussions that go on, or went on, between government and the institutions affected by governmental decision. The nature of those discussions, whether there were any at all. In the UK, this may be a familiar story to you, there were no discussions of any kind in 1991 leading to the casual merging of the universities with their polytechnics. The polys, many of them having achieved very successfully their own unique identities as teaching institutions at the time, were at a stroke of the pen became, quote, universities, meaning in that country, of course, research universities. And they were then assessed and funded as research universities. And over a decade, it's a sad decade to describe, the later governments have, by their funding policies, accepted that most of the polys are not research universities. They've come, one moment. The government has, by its funding policies, accepted that most of the polys are not research universities. So they have come with some distinct costs to all, nearly back to where they were before 1991, now not as a result of a policy, but of a failed policy. Grant Harman's examples also suggested that it is not only what decisions are made, but how they're made. His examples centered on the binary issue, but I think the principle is more general. The crucial question, for me anyway, is whether decisions are felt to be legitimate by those affected, broadly acceptable, whatever the private reservations, or are they felt to be policies simply imposed? And that in turn is shaped by the nature of the discussions and conversations leading up to them. Someone from the floor yesterday, I regret to say I didn't catch his name, called for a keen dialogue between institutions and government in Israel around the central and threatening issues that various speakers here have described. But what is a keen dialogue? Is it a set of conversations, or does it mean negotiation? Does it refer to occasions where the parties can meet informally, maybe, dare I suggest, over wine and food, outside a decision-making context, where the parties can really share the other's understanding of the issues, their often unspoken fears and hopes, attitudes and values? I've been impressed by how often human contacts outside decision-making meetings pave the way for more intelligent, thoughtful outcomes, outcomes that are more likely to be accepted as legitimate, as responsive to the real concerns of the various parties. I hope you have many such back-channel conversations and make them the bases for personal relationships across the institutional divide. Thank you.
guess we'll take 2 questions from the audience. Yes. Microphone.
Leslie Wagner from the UK. I feel a little vulnerable as the only, I think the only person from a UK institution here, and also facing Martin Trow's formidable reputation. But I disagree with him. It would take too long to say why I disagree with him. We'd need a round table of our own for an hour or two. Some of his comments are absolutely correct. The point I would want to make is, Martin, that you used the phrase unsuccessful. And the question comes to mind, what are the criteria by which we make those judgments? By some criteria, it's been unsuccessful. By other criteria, it's been extremely successful. You may not like some criteria that make it successful, but by those criteria, I think it has been successful. So I think we just need to stand back a bit before making those big judgments. And I speak as not only as an observer, but a participant observer. I ran 2 institutions during those 10-year periods, and it felt successful. My point is, when I come to the criteria, and it's the point, I may now say something that takes me out of the club, that is this very cosy club that we're in, which is that we've been a bit self-referential in all this. We seem to be thinking of the whole issue from the point of view of the institutions. Is it good for the institutions? I know we've said other things, but the issue of the accountability of higher education to society, and whether that accountability in a transition to mass higher education can be covered by non-quantifiable evaluations, by trust. Trust us, we know what we're doing. We will deliver you what we think you need, and even what you think you need. May not do, and doesn't do in most societies, when we move to mass higher education. And it's one of the costs, in my judgment, of moving to mass higher education. And so, again, from time to time we do mention something called students and their needs, but they come in left field occasionally. They don't seem to feature too strongly in our concerns. So I think we just, not because of the UK, but more generally, just need to get out a bit, actually, and not look inwards too much about what higher education is trying to do. My question, which is at the heart, I think, which hasn't been asked yet, but to me, and in the UK, has been at the heart of the issue. By the way, I think I made that point yesterday in my talk as an aside. I think it is possible. The question has to be asked, do we need the adjective research in front of the word universities? If we do need it, then we, by definition, assume there's something called non-research universities, and if we don't need it, then we shouldn't use it. Therefore, we must assume all universities are research universities, but we keep using the word research universities, which implies there must be some universities that are not research universities, and that's certainly the case in the UK. But underlying that point is the question I want to put, which is it possible to have high-quality teaching without a strong research base in an institution and by extension a department? If it isn't, and if the view is that you can't undertake bachelor teaching to a bachelor degree without an adequate research base, then there are things that flow, whatever, it doesn't matter what we call the institutions, whether they're universities or colleges, that's a structural and status issue. In terms of what we offer the student, that's the key question. By default, we seem, in all systems, California, UK as it so happens, and in Israel, to assume you can teach high quality to bachelor degree without adequate research. And if that's the case, then all the other issues are status. But we have to establish that first question. If you say you do need research, then you can't have a mass higher education system because no society can afford to pay for the quantity of students it wants to get to bachelor status through its own state taxes. You either have a private system or you have an elite system.
Thank you. I think there's some profound questions, and I believe that we have time this afternoon to discuss them. I'd like to...
Can I just reply for a moment?
Okay, go ahead.
Because I think your point about the criteria of success is right on. I really do think that to develop this, one would have to point to what I would take to be where is success, where is failure, and how it can very well be felt. Success can be felt, and where I think in a larger sense one could argue. But these are certainly subjective judgments, and they're based on a fair amount of field work and so forth. Some of it involves the testimony of teachers regarding the quality of teaching and what's happened to it over a period of time. What I can put very strongly, the corruption of administration in the management of paper. And I take to be the fundamental issue, has there been any damage to the recruitment of the university's fair share of the best young minds to academic life? That's a very important, and I don't think that Brits have really paid any attention to whether they're getting their fair share of the best young people to the academic profession. If the events of the last several decades have made academic work not as attractive, then we're living on the inherited capital of the able people in the institutions who came to it when it was a more attractive field. So I think those are questions I'd want to talk about with you. But on the definition of universities, you may have heard, we've uncoupled the word university from research. And where that isn't the case, then it involves a much more complicated matter, and I sort of made passing references to that. On the other point, I absolutely agree. There are different kinds of research, and various people have talked about what might be called the research of scholarship. I think that's the phrase that I recall. The continuing study of new work and ideas in a field, the continuing being abreast of the frontier of work in that field, the most interesting work, independent of kind of research in the ordinary sense of the word. And there I think that one of the crucial questions has been raised here yesterday, and that is of the continuing education of college teachers. And that involves sabbatical leave, involves the availability of institutions. And I guess I had thought that one important niche to be occupied by an open university is the continuing education of teachers. Sometimes it's done in schools and departments of education, but they're dealing with, they're sitting in the same classes with youngsters getting their credentials, and that's a different set of concerns and interests. So I have a feeling that there is a real potentially important area for some other institution, may very well be the Open University, to give itself, to devote itself to the ongoing continuing education of